Welcome to our video series on development economics. In this series, we shall delve into the critical themes of corruption, governance, and development institutions. I am Dr. Lawrence, and I will be guiding you through this journey. Together, we will explore how corruption distorts resource allocation, how governance shapes institutional outcomes, and how reforms can either strengthen or weaken development pathways. By the end of this session, you will understand not only the theoretical frameworks of institutional economics, but also real-world case studies from Nigeria, Ghana, and Indonesia that illustrate the successes and failures of anti-corruption reforms. Let's begin. Development goals like the MDGs and SDGs depend on good governance. But what happens when governance is undermined? The World Bank and IMF argue that corruption is the single biggest obstacle to transparency and effective planning. Today, we'll unpack their view, connect it to institutional economics, and examine Nigeria's experience. For the World Bank and IMF, corruption is not a side issue. It is the major obstacle to good governance. Transparency International CPI ranked Nigeria at 25 out of 100 in 2023. The World Bank's governance indicators also show Nigeria below regional averages. This confirms that corruption is not just anecdotal. It is measurable and persistent. Why? Because corruption distorts resource allocation. Instead of money going to schools, hospitals, or infrastructure, it gets diverted into private pockets. This weakens institutions, undermines trust, and reduces efficiency. Douglas North described institutions as the rules of the game in society. When corruption takes hold, those rules are weakened. Acemoglu and Robinson distinguish between inclusive institutions, which foster development, and extractive ones. Corruption sustains extractive institutions. It traps countries in poverty because resources are locked into patronage networks rather than productive investment. It is a structural issue shaping long-term development trajectories. Let's compare three countries that introduced World Bank and IMF anti-corruption reforms. Nigeria and Ghana illustrate how reforms can be undermined by political interference, while Indonesia demonstrates that external conditionalities can catalyze change. In Indonesia, external reforms met domestic ownership, making institutions resilient. In contrast, Nigeria's EFCC struggled with political interference, showing that external support fails without domestic political will. Anti-corruption reforms are not just technical fixes, they are political processes. Sustainable change requires inclusive institutions that citizens trust. Remember, external discipline matters, but domestic ownership decides success.
Welcome to ECO 462. Today we explore how corruption shapes governance and development institutions. The World Bank and IMF argue that corruption is the single biggest obstacle to transparency and effective planning. Let's unpack their view and connect it to institutional economics. For the World Bank and IMF, corruption is not a side issue. It is the major obstacle to good governance and transparency. It weakens institutions, undermines trust, and reduces efficiency. Nigeria spent over $30 billion on fuel subsidies between 2000 and 2018, yet much was lost to fraud. Even after subsidy removal in 2023, corruption shifted into palliative distribution networks. Power sector privatization was meant to deliver reliable electricity, but corruption in contracts and regulatory capture kept Nigerians in darkness. Fertilizer distribution was designed to support farmers, but ghost beneficiaries diverted up to 40% of subsidized fertilizer. Corruption doesn't just waste money, it undermines the effectiveness of policy reforms. In institutional economics, this reflects extractive institutions that concentrate power and wealth, rather than inclusive ones that promote shared prosperity. We shared prosperity. Now, let's connect this to institutional economics. Douglas North describes institutions as the rules of the game in society, the formal and informal constraints that shape human interaction. When corruption takes hold, those rules are weakened. Instead of fair competition, we see favoritism. Instead of predictable enforcement, we see uncertainty. Acemoglu and Robinson in Why Nations Fail, 2012, distinguish between inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. Inclusive institutions foster development by creating opportunities, protecting property rights, and encouraging innovation. Extractive institutions, by contrast, concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few. Here's the key point. Corruption sustains extractive institutions. It traps countries in poverty because resources are locked into patronage networks rather than productive investment. So corruption is not just a moral issue. It is a structural issue. It shapes incentives, determines outcomes, and influences whether a country builds inclusive institutions that foster development or extractive ones that hold it back. Key points to note. North, institutions equal the rules of the game. Acemoglu and Robinson, inclusive versus extractive. Corruption leads to extractive institutions, which create a poverty trap. Can you think of an example in Nigeria where corruption turned an institution from inclusive to answers include electoral commerce. The major pillars include procurement reform, requiring transparent bidding processes to reduce rent-seeking and favoritism. Example, Nigeria's procurement reforms under the Public Procurement Act 2007 were supported by World Bank programs, but implementation has been uneven due to political interference. Financial disclosure, mandating that public officials declare their assets to prevent illicit enrichment. Example, asset declaration requirements in Nigeria have often been undermined by weak enforcement, but they remain a cornerstone of IMF governance reforms. Anti-money laundering measures, strengthening financial systems to detect and prevent illicit financial flows. Example, Nigeria's AML framework was expanded under IMF guidance, but enforcement challenges persist, especially with politically exposed persons. Strengthening audit institutions, building capacity in supreme audit offices and anti-corruption agencies to monitor public spending. Example, Nigeria's Auditor General's office has received donor support, but reports are often ignored by political actors. The logic is straightforward. Without tackling corruption, development financing will be wasted, and reforms will fail to deliver tangible results. Do you think external conditionalities are effective in tackling corruption, or do they undermine sovereignty? Some argue they enforce discipline, while others believe they clash with local realities. Activity, negotiating reform, IMF versus Nigeria. Group A will act as IMF negotiators, insisting on strict conditionalities. Group B will act as Nigerian policymakers, defending sovereignty and feasibility. Each group prepares arguments, then presents. Debrief. Which side made the stronger case? Could a compromise be reached? The lesson. Reforms succeed only when external discipline meets domestic ownership. Reflect on these questions. How do external conditionalities align with Nigeria's institutional framework? Do they strengthen inclusive institutions or risk reinforcing extractive ones? How did IMF negotiators justify conditionalities? How did Nigerian policymakers defend sovereignty? Which arguments felt more persuasive and why? How effective have Nigeria's EFCC or Auditor General's office been with donor support? What lessons can Nigeria learn from Indonesia's KPK? If advising Nigeria's Ministry of Finance today, which single conditionality would you prioritize and why? Audit institutions produce reports, but political actors ignore them. These challenges highlight the tension between external discipline and domestic sovereignty. Comparative insights remind us that reform is possible. Indonesia's KPK became a global model of resilience, showing how strong institutions can resist political interference. Ghana's procurement reforms improved transparency, though enforcement lagged. These cases illustrate that external support must be matched by domestic commitment. For Nigeria, the path forward requires balancing external conditionalities with local ownership. Anti-corruption programs must be embedded in inclusive institutions that foster transparency, accountability, and efficiency. Otherwise, they risk reinforcing extractive systems. As future policymakers, scholars, and leaders, you must ask, how can external reforms be adapted to local contexts? How can Nigeria build institutions that are not only formally compliant, but substantively credible? The answer lies in combining external frameworks with domestic political will, civil society engagement, and institutional resilience. Remember, corruption is not just a moral failing. It is structural, systemic, and deeply embedded in governance. Tackling it requires more than conditionalities. It requires building institutions that are inclusive, transparent, and accountable. Only then can development financing translate into sustainable progress. So far, we've seen that corruption undermines governance, distorts resource allocation, and sustains extractive institutions. For the World Bank and IMF, tackling corruption is central to development assistance. For institutional economists, corruption is structural. It shapes the rules of the game. The key lesson is clear. Without credible institutions, development goals remain on paper. Corruption transforms potentially inclusive institutions into extractive ones, trapping societies in cycles of poverty and mistrust. Electoral commissions lose legitimacy when votes are manipulated. Public procurement becomes a channel for rent-seeking instead of service delivery. The judiciary, when compromised, erodes the very foundation of justice and accountability. In Nigeria, these examples are not abstract. Fuel subsidy reforms lost billions to fraudulent claims. Fertilizer subsidies were diverted to ghost beneficiaries. Power sector privatization promised reliable electricity, but was undermined by corruption in contracts and regulatory capture. Each case shows how corruption reshapes institutions, turning them from inclusive to extractive. Yet, history also shows that reform is possible. Indonesia's creation of the Corruption Eradication Commission strengthened accountability. Ghana's procurement reforms under IMF programs improved transparency, even if enforcement remained weak. These examples remind us that institutions can be rebuilt, but only with sustained commitment to transparency, accountability, and enforcement. For Nigeria, the challenge is urgent. Without tackling corruption, no amount of financial support or policy is good enough.